Recently, I published my first book. Well, actually, John Wiley & Sons published my first book. I had to write it, however. The Golden Revolution, in which I make the rather provocative, controversial claim that we're going back onto a gold standard, whether we like it or not. It is simply inevitable. And I know that inevitable is a strong word, but that's why you have to write a book about it. It's very difficult to defend such a strong assertion, but that's exactly what I'm about to do. Now, cast your way back to the once upon a time period of 1979-1980. We're probably all familiar with this period in history when the dollar was in free fall, not just versus major currencies, but most currencies, and also versus gold. Gold was rising exponentially in price, not just versus the dollar, but versus currencies generally. U.S. interest rates were also soaring. You know, there was a proper economic crisis. The U.S. economy had lost the confidence of the world, and you were starting to see the effects at the end of the 1970s. And gold at one point got to around $850 an ounce, a price which we wouldn't see again, of course, until quite recently. Now, that's all in the history books, and that's fine. But when you get big price moves like that, you know, somebody's buying, somebody's selling. Actual flows are taking place. Now, why? Who was behind this? Why was the gold chart going parabolic? Who was buying? What was their agenda? Were they frightened? Were they greedy? What was it about? Well, this was such a dramatic episode in the economic history of the United States that, lo and behold, Hollywood got in on the act. Hollywood, yes, that's right. This is the original movie poster for the hit film Rollover, starring Kris Kristofferson, who was a very big star at the time, Jane Fonda, of course, very big star, and directed by acclaimed Oscar-nominated, BAFTA-nominated director Alan Pakula. This was a big-budget, major studio Hollywood film. What was it about? The dollar crisis, and about what was really behind the dollar crisis of 79-80. Well, guess what? During this film, there are lots of provocative statements made about why exactly the dollar was going down, why exactly the price of gold was going up. And in one scene, there is a gentleman representing the OPEC oil producers who are secretly moving their accumulated dollar wealth and reserves into gold. And this representative of OPEC is explaining to his private banker why, in fact, he's decided to greatly accelerate his gold purchases. And he says, I sense other people are doing the same thing. Everybody's beginning to do the same thing. We oil producers, we OPEC nations do not want to be stuck with worthless pieces of paper. Right out of the film. If you do look at the history books, if you do look at the film, at the flows, the data that's available, it's clear that this sort of thing was going on, if not to the degree that Hollywood depicted it in the film. But think about that for a moment. Worthless pieces of paper. Well, a little history. You know, what is a dollar after all? I mean, if you go back far enough, a dollar was literally, legally, a Spanish milled dollar, otherwise known as a piece of 8. Because that's how you made change back in those days. You literally took your Spanish milled dollar and you divided it into halves, quarters, or even up to eighths to make change. That's what a dollar was. The 1792 Gold Coinage Act, the very first act of Congress in the United States to specify what a dollar was, chose this definition. It is a Spanish milled dollar, and they gave a specific weight for that definition. There it is. 371 grains of 4/16 parts of pure, or 416 grains of standard silver. It doesn't get more specific than that. The dollar used to be defined in this very clear way in terms of silver and also gold. There was also a gold clause in the Gold Coinage Act. Fast forward to today. What is a dollar? Well, that's what it looks like, right? In paper form anyway. And there's your definition. It's right on the front of every US dollar bill. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. There you go. But isn't that actually a little bit vague? it doesn't refer to a specific weight of anything. It doesn't refer to a specific amount of anything. In fact, the amount of dollars is constantly in flux, although it primarily goes up, of course, rather than goes down. But for most of the dollar's history, whether actual coinage or banknotes were used, the United States was on a gold standard. This is a gold certificate. Prior to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's confiscation of gold in 1933, this was your standard dollar. This is what it looked like. A gold certificate. You could take that dollar and you could walk into any licensed commercial bank in the United States and you could exchange it for gold coin. Indeed, do you see the fine print at the bottom of this dollar? It says that this will pay to the bearer on demand in gold coin the amount on the bill, in this case $20. Of course, this all came to an end. In 1971, President Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard. But how did that process start? How did this process of the U.S. deciding to leave the gold standard get going? Well, actually, a rather famous French gentleman, President Charles de Gaulle, started it in 1965. In February 1965, he made a famous statement for the history books, where he directly assaulted the Bretton Woods arrangements, the post-World War II gold standard, as not being in the interests of France or other countries for that matter. It might be in the U.S. interest, but not that of other countries. And he was very clear about his reasons why. Because the world needed a standard that was gold, gold whose nature does not alter. Well, eventually, this was reported in the press. In fact, it was reported in the press just a few days later. Time magazine, major U.S. periodical, said very provocatively, perhaps never in history has a friendly head of state launched such an assault on monetary policy. So there you have it. It was a bombshell. And sure enough, from 1965 to 1971, there was a series of monetary crises. There were periodic attempts to shift out of dollars and into gold. But because the price of gold was fixed in dollar terms, that meant an actual physical drain on the U.S. dollar, on the U.S.'s gold reserve. And so, in August 1971, another rather famous gentleman, this one American, President Richard Nixon, chose to take the U.S. temporarily off the gold standard. Now, I emphasize that word for a reason. In his speech announcing the suspension of gold convertibility, he was very clear this was a temporary measure.
Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Now, I'm not sure exactly what definition of temporary he was using. It must be an epochal definition of temporary because it's been over 40 years now. But of course, we know that sometimes emergency temporary measures undertaken by governments tend not to be so temporary after all. But anyway, he made the decision. He said this was the way to end these crises that were affecting the United States, and he blamed those crises on the international money speculators. He neglected to mention, of course, that the vast bulk of the trading in gold that was taking place was actually driven by central banks themselves, exchanging dollar reserves for gold reserves. It was much easier to pick on these phantom international money speculators as the reason why it happened. But it did happen. It did happen. The fact is the U.S. was running fiscal deficits through the 1960s that were so large, people just assumed at some point the dollar would devalue, and finally, beginning in August 1971, the dollar did devalue. And what happened thereafter? Nixon unleashed unprecedented monetary inflation. The U.S. money supply, and by extension the global money supply, has grown exponentially, not just linearly, exponentially ever since. And in fact, one of the periods of most rapid dollar money supply growth, and by extension global growth, was between 2002, when the Fed cut rates very, very dramatically in response to the dot-com bust, and 2007 at the beginning of the blow-up of the U.S. housing market bubble and associated global credit bubble. Look at the accelerated rate that was occurring at the time. This monetary inflation, however, was not necessarily leading to dramatic consumer price inflation in the U.S., but it was fueling asset price inflation around the world, and it was fueling consumer price inflation around the world, in particular in emerging markets. But curiously enough, notwithstanding the financial crisis that began in 2008, that price inflation continues. You have not had outright deflation in the vast majority of economies around the world since 2008. You've still had price inflation, and money inflation is still growing exponentially. This situation, however, that we are now in, I am now going to explain to you how post-crisis, with the U.S. economy stuck in the doldrums and the Fed desperately trying to get it going with monetary stimulus, this has fundamentally destabilized the global monetary regime, still centered on the dollar as the key reserve currency. Here we go. Signs that it's breaking down? Does anyone recall this article from October 2009, almost exactly 1 year after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt and it looked like the world was going to come to an end? This is an article by veteran reporter Robert Fisk, and he's claiming here that the oil-producing countries, China, Japan, France, and possibly others, have been engaged in secret discussions for how to replace the dollar in the global oil trade. To replace it with what? Speculation in the article was to replace it with a basket of currencies, including a specific reference to gold being in the basket. October 2009, a credible reporter published this article. The financial crisis very quickly appears to have unleashed some behind-the-scenes discussions on the part of the countries listed here, obviously very important economies. More recently, the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, hold regular summits. At the summit in 2011, they made the following statement, or declaration as they call it, where they directly accuse the dollar-centric global monetary regime as not being in the interests of the world, and certainly not in their collective interest. An echo of what President de Gaulle said in February 1965, to be sure. More recently, the BRICS are getting even harsher in their language. At their summit last month in New Delhi, India, they came right out and said that they felt that U.S. foreign policy now, towards Iran was unproductive, was not in their interests, and that the U.S. should basically relax its pressure for sanctions on Iran and back down. Now think about this group. Okay, Russia, traditional adversary of the U.S., fine. You can see them maybe taking a hard line. And they also have quite substantial business interests in trade with Iran. China, well, okay. They're also increasingly dependent on Iranian oil production, so naturally they would be concerned about sanctions on Iran. India? I mean, India sort of cozied up to the United States over the past decade. Why are they agreeing to this sort of language? Brazil? No, Brazil's in Latin America, obviously has had tight relations with the U.S. for a long time. They're saying things like this? The fact is, both in monetary arrangements and in general foreign policy, there are clearly large and escalating disputes between the up-and-coming economies in the world and the declining economies of the world.
There are more than one way in which this could happen. One of them is that one country becomes a clear first mover and completely surprises the entire world, including the United States, by pegging its currency to gold explicitly. Russia is not an unreasonable country that might, under certain circumstances, decide to do precisely that. So imagine, if you will, at some point, say August 2013, Russia announces to the world that it will henceforth back the currency, which they could rename if they wanted to, by gold explicitly. What happens? Well, think about it. Investors around the world, concerned about U.S. finances, concerned about U.S. economic policy, think maybe we should diversify our dollars. Maybe we should cash out some of our dollar reserves and hold these new gold-backed Russian reserves instead. Well, if that process starts in earnest, and if some countries start to diversify out of dollars, other countries will have to take up the slack. What if they don't take up the slack? The dollar will decline, potentially precipitously. You can imagine a situation in which you have another crisis meeting, say at Camp David, just as occurred to determine how to deal with the breakdown of Bretton Woods. President Nixon decided to close the gold window. What would be decided this time around? It's quite possible that if the United States sees the rest of the world moving in this direction, that the United States will simply decide it must follow along. It has no other choice other than for the dollar to lose reserve status entirely.
And here you see it. Here you see graphical evidence that US dollar monetary hegemony is clearly coming to an end. The BRIC economies, taken collectively, are now overtaking the United States. And all forecasts are that they will continue to grow more rapidly than the United States in recent years. When the Bretton Woods arrangements were put together, the US was essentially half the entire global economy. Today, it has slipped to only about 20%. And that share is continuing to decline. The idea that the dollar should be the single preeminent global reserve currency is starting to look a little bit past its sell-by date. Now, let's think for a moment about this world we live in. If the US is no longer a hegemon, and we have up-and-coming powers, multiples of them, well, guess what? We live in a multipolar world. Nobel laureate Robert Mundell has identified that one reason why the global monetary regime is now so unstable is because of the changing role of the dollar. It is no longer the one be-all reserve currency. It is being undermined by the weakness of the US economy and these developments elsewhere. And importantly, if you go back to something Mundell said some years ago, he stated that the period when the gold standard prevailed was unique in world history. Why was it unique? Because it represented a multipolar world. The classical gold standard of the 19th century was, he believed, appropriate for a multipolar world, not appropriate necessarily for a hegemonic one. Now, this is a Nobel laureate talking about multipolarity in the gold standard, and guess what? We're back into a multipolar world. Another professor, a gentleman by the name of Giulio Gallerotti, professor in the United States, wrote a book recently where he pointed out how declining great powers tend to cling to hegemonic policies long after they no longer serve their interest. Not only do those hegemonic policies no longer serve their interest, they backfire. They start doing things that actually force the rest of the world to act in ways that are contrary to that attempt to exercise hegemonic power, just like the BRICS pushing back on the US regarding its stance towards Iran. Professor Gallerotti is also one of the key authorities on how the classical gold standard came into being back in the 19th century. Well, he said, in fact, the reason why the gold standard emerged was because there was a breakdown in international cooperation. Nobody could agree whose currency should serve as the reserve, should serve as the standard. The only currency they could agree upon was the one currency that no one country could manipulate. No one country could print. No one country could control the supply of arbitrarily. And that one currency that nobody could manipulate was gold. Now, who's familiar with the concept of a Nash equilibrium? Game theory. Well, there was a very popular film from 2002 called A Beautiful Mind, focusing on the life of John Nash, who came up with the concept of a Nash equilibrium, which is central to game theory analysis to this day. Here's a picture of Russell Crowe playing the young John Nash in the film, looking out the window of a classroom. There's a great scene in this film, a great scene where he is in a bar with some friends of his, and in walk a handful of young ladies, one of whom is blonde and just looks particularly attractive vis-a-vis the other ladies who walk in with her, her brunette friends. And he realizes then and there that he and his buddies, if they want to have a chance to dance and spend some time with these young ladies, not one of them can actually try to go straight to the blonde and dance with her. Not one of them can do it. Why? Because if one tries to do it, they'll all try to do it. They'll compete, she'll be put off and they'll fail. But if they simply go straight to her friends, her brunette friends, well then guess what? They'll all quite welcome the attention, and he and all of his friends will get to dance and spend some time with these nice young ladies. In other words, what appears suboptimal from an individual's point of view in a game is in fact the most optimal outcome when you take into account the other players' strategies, the Nash equilibrium. Now, the resolution for that situation, that is to arrive at a stable equilibrium out of what appears an unstable situation, the same can be applied to where we are with the rising powers today and the declining U.S. hegemonic monetary power. No one necessarily wants to be a first mover back to a gold standard because it would be disruptive. No one wants to destabilize what is already an unstable economy globally, where you have financial crises left, right, and center. It's not just Greece, it's not just the euro area. The US has serious issues, Japan has serious issues, let's face it. But no one has to be a first mover. No one has to try and simply devalue their currency versus everyone else, and no one has to be a first mover back to gold. It can happen simultaneously and in concert. And when you understand how a Nash equilibrium works and you put it together with what the BRIC countries are actually saying, this is where we're going. A Nash equilibrium process is going to take us back onto gold. I don't know exactly what form it's going to take, but some form it will. Also in the background, there was an article in the FT recently pointing out how banks are actually lobbying the Bank for International Settlements, which determines Tier 1 capital requirements. Banks are lobbying the BIS to try to get them to allow gold as collateral, as Tier 1 collateral. Why? Banks have tons of bad loans on the books. Lots of Tier 1 collateral is no longer Tier 1 collateral because of ratings downgrades for sovereign government bonds. It's not just Greece. So banks are desperate for Tier 1 collateral, and they're begging the BIS to allow gold to be used as Tier 1 collateral. Well, wait a minute. Even if no country is moving formally back onto a gold standard, if banks start using gold as collateral, that is in effect moving you back towards a de facto gold standard where gold actually serves as money in the banking system, not in a transactional sense, but in a reserve sense. This is how far we've come. We've come a long way towards getting back onto a gold standard. It's occurring behind the scenes. Now, if I'm right, and we are in some way, shape, or form going to end up back onto a gold standard, either because one country just starts to make the move on its own, a group of countries move collectively, such as the BRICS, or it happens de facto through the banking system in the background, what sort of gold price would be associated with a proper remonetization of gold, the world moving back onto a gold standard? Well, first point to consider is the debt burden. There's too much debt in the world. It's not serviceable at current valuations. It's not. It's not just about Greece. It's about debt in general. There's too much. It has to be reduced. This just shows you the U.S. debt to GDP ratio, which grew exponentially over the past couple of decades. The debt has to come down. But if central banks won't let it come down in nominal terms because they keep printing money as investors try to reduce their debt burden, well then guess what? It's going to come down in real terms instead. Central banks will hold rates at very, very low levels. Currencies will depreciate in value in general relative to real assets because the opportunity cost of holding real assets is so low, and the price of gold just goes up and up and up as interest rates remain low. I published a study on exactly this effect back in 2003. I called a major secular gold bull market as a result back in 2003. I see no reason to change my view now. Everything that central banks are doing, everything policymakers are doing tells me that interest rates are going to stay low, they are going to continue printing money, and the price of gold will continue rising, which helps to value that accumulated debt burden, which is just unserviceable at current valuations. And so what you can finally do is you can actually take the money supply, in this case in dollars, and you can take that money supply and you can actually take U.S. gold reserves, and you can pose the hypothetical. If the United States specifically goes back to a gold standard, and it has to back its money supply with gold reserves, what ratios lead to what prices. It's simple arithmetic at that point. And what you find is that if the U.S. is going to back its narrow money supply, bank reserves and notes and coins in circulation, if it's going to back its narrow money supply with gold, the price of gold will have to rise to about $7,500. But that is only the narrow money supply. What happens to a bank if the broad money supply contracts? Bank deposits. What if everyone wants to cash out of bank deposits and go back into notes and coins? What do you think is going to happen to your high street bank? It's going to close for business for good. As a result, I think it's more plausible that if the U.S. or other countries move back to a gold standard, again, I think they will at some point, they'll back the broad money supply, or at least some portion of the broad money supply, with gold. Here I take a 40% coverage ratio. Why? Because historically that was actually stipulated in the Federal Reserve Act that the U.S. had to maintain, the Federal Reserve had to maintain 40% gold backing for dollar notes and coins in circulation. And if you do that with broad money today, a 40% gold backing takes you to a theoretical imputed gold price of $13,200. I know it sounds crazy, but look at the mess we're in. And if the way this mess is going to be resolved, the way credibility and stability is to be resolved is to move back onto gold, these prices follow logically. That's what my book's about. I hope you found this interesting. If you'd like to learn more, you can read the book. There is some material regarding the book that I left with you here, so thank you very much.